In 1914, the world was told a simple story, and Europe accidentally fell into the deadliest war it had ever seen. But wars don't run on behind the speeches, behind the flags, behind the trenches soaked in blood. There was another battlefield, one fought in banks, bond markets, and private loan agreements. While soldiers died by the millions, vast fortunes were being built quietly, legally, and invisibly. This was not just a military war. It was a money war. And to understand World War I, we must follow the money to the bankers who financed it, shaped it, and profited from its endless destruction. Before the first shot of World War I was fired, Europe was already drowning in debt. By the early 20th century, the great powers of Europe were no longer self-funded empires. They were credit-driven states, dependent on private banks, central banks, and international financial networks to function. Governments borrowed to build railways, expand navies, modernize armies, and maintain colonial empires that no longer paid for themselves. War, in this system, was impossible without bankers. Modern warfare required enormous upfront capital. Weapons factories had to be paid before weapons were produced. Soldiers had to be fed, clothed, transported, and paid. Railroads, ammunition, artillery, and logistics demanded cash immediately, not promises of future victory. This is where banks became indispensable. Across Europe, financial institutions specialized in government bonds and war loans. These bonds allowed states to borrow massive sums from private investors, promising repayment with interest after the war. In theory, victory would pay the bill. In reality, defeat or stalemate simply meant more borrowing. By 1914, Europe's major powers were deeply entangled with their creditors. Governments could not mobilize armies without first securing financing. Military planning and financial planning became inseparable. Crucially, banks did not care about national borders the way politicians did. Money flowed across rival empires. Banks in one country often financed industries and governments in another. This created a strange reality. Nations prepared to fight each other using weapons funded by the same international financial system. As tensions rose in the years before World War I, military budgets exploded. Naval arms races, especially between Britain and Germany, pushed governments further into debt. Each new battleship, each artillery upgrade, meant another bond issue, another loan, another guaranteed profit for financiers. War was risky for nations, but for banks, it was predictable business. Once war began, governments could not simply stop spending. The longer the war lasted, the more they borrowed, and the more they borrowed, the more powerful their creditors became. By the summer of 1914, Europe was financially primed for catastrophe. Political tension lit the match, but credit made the explosion possible. World War I was not created in a vacuum of ideology or nationalism alone. It emerged from a world where money had already bound nations into a fragile, dangerous system, one that would soon turn global conflict into an unprecedented financial opportunity. When World War I began in August 1914, no major power was financially prepared for a long war. European leaders expected a short conflict, weeks, maybe months. Instead, they triggered an industrial-scale war that burned money faster than any conflict in human history. Within the first year, government treasuries were already collapsing under the cost. This is where the bankers stepped fully into the war. Governments could not simply print money without destroying their currencies. Taxes could not be raised fast enough. The only solution was massive borrowing, on a scale never seen before. War bonds became the backbone of the conflict. States issued bonds to banks, financial institutions, and wealthy investors, promising future repayment with interest. Banks underwrote these bonds, marketed them, and resold them to the public. Every bond sold meant guaranteed profit through fees, commissions, and long-term interest payments. The longer the war dragged on, the larger the bond issues became. Britain, France, Germany, and later the United States all relied on this system. Entire national economies were reorganized around debt. Factories no longer produced consumer goods, they produced weapons, financed by loans that assumed victory would eventually cover the cost. Banks were no longer neutral intermediaries. They became essential war partners. In many cases, governments consulted bankers before making strategic decisions. Financial institutions advised states on how much longer they could fight, how much debt markets could absorb, and when new loans are possible. Military endurance became a question not of morale, but of credit. As casualties mounted, so did borrowing. Trench warfare turned World War I into a war of attrition. Millions of shells were fired for minimal territorial gain. Every day of fighting consumed enormous resources. Every failed offensive meant another round of loans. Banks understood something politicians rarely admitted publicly. A short war was bad for business. A long war was extremely profitable. This did not mean bankers controlled generals or ordered battles, but the financial structure they provided made prolonged war not only possible, but sustainable. Without continuous access to credit, the war would have collapsed economically long before it collapsed militarily. Neutral banks also played a critical role. Financial institutions in neutral countries facilitated international payments, currency exchanges, and trade in raw materials. Even when nations were officially enemies, money continued to move through global financial channels. War severed diplomatic ties, but it did not shut down finance. By 1916, World War I had become a financial trap. Governments were borrowing simply to pay interest on previous loans. Victory was no longer about winning territory. It was about avoiding bankruptcy. Ending the war without decisive victory risked financial ruin. At this point, bankers were no longer just financing the war. They were locking nations into it. The battlefield may have been in France and Eastern Europe, but the real chains were forged in ledgers, contracts, and debt agreements that would shape the world long after the guns fell silent. When World War I erupted in 1914, the United States officially declared neutrality. Politically, America stayed out of Europe's war. Financially, it stepped straight into the center of it. At the start of the conflict, American banks became the lifeline of the Allied powers, especially Britain and France. Cut off from many traditional sources of credit and trade, these nations turned increasingly to U.S. financial institutions for loans, raw materials, food, and weapons. What began as limited commercial transactions quickly transformed into systematic war financing. American banks extended massive lines of credit to the Allies, allowing them to purchase supplies on an industrial scale. US factories boomed, shipping arms, ammunition, and equipment across the Atlantic, all paid for with borrowed money. This created a dangerous imbalance. By 1916, Britain and France were deeply indebted to American banks. Their ability to continue fighting depended not on battlefield success, but on continued access to U.S. credit. A defeat for the Allies would not only reshape Europe, it would also threaten the repayment of enormous American loans. Neutrality, at this point, became fragile. American financial interests were now tied to a specific outcome of the war. If the Allies collapsed, U.S. banks stood to lose billions. If the Allies won, those debts would be repaid with interest, potentially for generations. The war had turned America into a creditor empire. This financial reality placed quiet pressure on U.S. policymakers. While no banker declared war, the structure of debt made continued neutrality increasingly unrealistic. The United States had more to lose from an Allied defeat than from entering the war itself. By the time America formally entered World War I in 1917, the decision was not only strategic or ideological, it was financially logical. Once the U.S. joined the war, the scale of lending exploded. The American government itself began issuing loans to allied nations, replacing private banks as the primary lender. But this did not end banker influence, it institutionalized it. The war was now financed by entire national banking systems, backed by government guarantees. At the same time, Germany faced a very different financial reality. Blockaded and isolated from global credit markets, it relied heavily on internal borrowing and currency expansion. While the Allies borrowed internationally, Germany was financially sealed inside its own economy, a disadvantage that would prove decisive. By 1918, the financial outcome of the war was already clear. Europe was devastated. Its economies were shattered. Its governments were buried under mountains of debt. The United States, by contrast, emerged as the world's largest creditor. World War I did not just redraw borders, it shifted global financial power. For the first time, the center of world finance moved decisively away from Europe and toward the United States. Banks, currencies, and capital flows now revolved around American credit. The battlefield had ended the war, but the balance sheets determined who truly won. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world expected peace to heal what war had destroyed. Instead, the end of World War I created a new financial battlefield, one where debt replaced gunfire. Europe was ruined. Entire regions were physically destroyed. Industrial output had collapsed, and millions of workers were dead or disabled. Yet the war's bills had not disappeared. They had only matured. Governments now faced an impossible problem. How do you repay debts when your economy no longer exists? For Britain and France, the answer was clear and brutal. They demanded reparations from Germany. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war and pay enormous sums to the Allied powers. Publicly, these reparations were framed as punishment. Privately, they served another purpose: to funnel money through Europe's shattered economies and back toward creditors. Germany would pay France and Britain. France and Britain would use that money to service their war debts, especially those owed to the United States. This created a fragile financial loop. Germany, itself economically broken, had to borrow money, often from American banks, to pay reparations. That money then flowed to Britain and France, which sent it back to American creditors. In effect, U.S. banks were lending money to Germany, so Germany could pay Britain and France, so Britain and France could repay the United States. The system was absurd and unstable. Banks supported this arrangement because it kept debt payments flowing. Governments supported it because there was no alternative. But the structure rested on constant borrowing, political compliance, and economic growth that did not exist. For ordinary people, the consequences were devastating. Germany experienced hyperinflation in the early 1920s, wiping out savings and destroying the middle class. Britain and France imposed harsh taxes and austerity to meet debt obligations. Social unrest spread across Europe as citizens paid for a war they never chose and a financial system they could not escape. The peace treaties did not stabilize the world. They financialized its collapse. Rather than forgiving debts or restructuring the system, policymakers doubled down. Banks continued to collect interest. Governments continued to borrow. And the global economy remained trapped in a cycle of obligation and resentment. World War I had ended, but the money war continued. The financial pressures created by war debts and reparations poisoned international relations throughout the 1920s. Cooperation became impossible. Trust evaporated. Every economic crisis became a political crisis. This fragile system would eventually collapse in the Great Depression, and when it did, the world would once again turn to war. Not because history repeated itself blindly, but because the financial consequences of World War I were never truly resolved. World War I is remembered as a tragedy of empires, alliances, and miscalculation. Millions died, nations collapsed, borders were redrawn. But beneath the visible destruction was a quieter, longer-lasting legacy, one written in debt, contracts, and financial dependence. The bankers did not fire the first shot in Sarajevo. They did not command armies or draft soldiers. What they did was make the war possible to sustain. Modern industrial warfare could not exist without vast, continuous financing. Once governments accepted that reality, they surrendered a part of their sovereignty. Decisions of war and peace became inseparable from credit access, bond markets, and repayment schedules. World War I revealed a new truth about power. Military strength mattered, but financial endurance mattered more. The nations that could borrow the longest could fight the longest. And the nation that emerged as the world's primary creditor emerged as the war's true winner. The United States did not conquer Europe with armies. It inherited influence through balance sheets. By the war's end, Europe's empires were exhausted and indebted. Their political authority weakened. Their economic independence gone. In contrast, American finance stood at the center of the global system, shaping reconstruction, diplomacy, and future conflicts. The so-called peace after World War I failed because it addressed territory, not debt. It punished nations but preserved financial structures that demanded endless repayment. That unresolved imbalance fueled resentment, instability, and ultimately another global war. This is the hidden money war of World War I, a war where profit outlived victory, where debts outlasted empires, and where the true cost was not paid in 1918 but across the entire 20th century. To understand modern power, modern wars, and modern empires, we must remember this lesson. Wars may be fought by soldiers, but they are shaped, sustained, and survived by money.